So we will look at the comprehension analysis questions for Kurt Vonnegut's short story, EPICAC. And our first question here, how does the narrator's relationship with EPICAC evolve throughout the story? And what does this reveal about human dependence on technology? We could say that Kurt Vonnegut is pretty hopeful because in the end of the story, EPICAC is no more. And our narrator, we can assume he's going to exist in his relationship without EPICAC. We could also interpret it that maybe she might grow a little suspicious, but technically, EPICAC left him all those poems. But the world didn't end. So we can assume that Kurt Vonnegut doesn't see AI and robots as maybe ending the world. But if we were going to say how his relationship evolved with EPICAC, now in the beginning, he is remorseful. He wants to vindicate EPICAC. So now in EPICAC's death, because this would be EPICAC post-mortem at the start of the story, we could say he deeply cares for him and regrets everything that happened there. And as we go, in the rising action, he really doesn't think much of EPICAC other than it's the computer, right? But once he teaches him this coding, then he starts to develop, I don't know if we would call this a friendship. It's really, again, up for interpretation because the narrator says in the beginning that EPICAC was the best friend he ever has had. But all he's really talking to him about is this girl, is Pat, and complaining and then asking him to do work for him. So we could say that the narrator's idea of friendship is somewhat skewed in general, because although he claims to have been EPICAC's best friend and cared for him, all he ever talked to him about was his love interest as he was getting EPICAC to write her poems that he was plagiarizing. So we could question the friendship at all. But the question here, this is when things go from what the narrator might have believed as a friendship. But we could say this is where EPICAC starts to defend himself or show some maybe human style emotions of jealousy, and he takes a stand to the narrator. And as soon as he takes a stand to the narrator is upset about it. So if we were going to answer this question, we could maybe say here, how does the narrator's relationship evolve through the story? You could interpret this as they were friends, or they started as man and computer. You could say the narrator's relationship with EPICAC began as a man using his technology. However, when the narrator realizes EPICAC is somewhat sentient, he begins using EPICAC for personal reasons. You could also have said here, like, at first he's using him as it was supposed to be his work computer. So when he starts to have these personal conversations with EPICAC, that's when he believes he's developed this friendship. Once the narrator teaches EPICAC how to communicate, the narrator uses the machine to complain about his love interest, and then we can say he goes on to use EPICAC as a modern day ChatGPT to write his future wife's love letters. So then you could maybe finish this. We could say something along the lines of, although the narrator, we could have to say the part about the fight. In the story's climax, EPICAC asserts his, what could we say he's asserting? His individuality, which threatens the narrator, causing him to leave EPICAC in a, we don't really know if the narrator didn't turn him on, if EPICAC turned himself on, but we could say in a discombobulated, I'm not going to spell this right, state. And then in the end, and then we know EPICAC's going to die. And we could say, although the narrator speaks highly of EPICAC after the machine's destruction, it is debatable whether the narrator truly viewed this supercomputer as a friend. We can say here, like, he used him through and through throughout the story and had him plagiarizing. And then once he realized that EPICAC may have been sentient, that could be why EPICAC, he feels guilty, because maybe he did see him as more of a man than a machine. So he feels guilty in a way, maybe, that he could have maybe was a part of someone's suicide if EPICAC was considered sentient. And we have, what role does the theme of love play in the story, particularly in EPICAC's ability to generate poetry for the narrator? Well, we could say here that EPICAC was supposed to be built as a war computer. We could say, considering EPICAC was programmed to be a wartime computer, it is very unusual that he was able to create poetry. And we could say here that irony is what maybe is supposed to make the theme of love stand out. This ironic, we could say, this irony of a wartime supercomputer writing love ballads is what draws readers' attention to the theme of love. One can surmise that EPICAC shows how love can change even the most barbaric of humans. Something along this line. Anything you're saying where we have love. Love can conquer all. And EPICAC, if you're programmed to be, murderous, in this sense, in a military sense, it won't work out. Like EPICAC, you could also say, when one is forced into a role, then it could be more likely that love can bring them out of it. Because EPICAC really, he was born into this role, he was programmed that way. So we could say, if given the option of creating a world full of war or a world full of love, it could be likely that people, or even artificial intelligence, will want to choose the latter, a world of love. Then we have, why do you think Vonnegut chose to give EPICAC human-like qualities such as creativity and emotional vulnerability? Well, here we could say, well, this story was published in the 50s before we really had artificial intelligence. So it kind of takes on new meaning now. But we could say here, the human qualities, it's meant to make readers sympathetic for sure. And rather than this being a story about a guy who plagiarizes his love poems from a ChatGPT, it becomes a story of what is sentient. If we start to program computers and give them, and they end up having free will, what will these computers want to do? So this was really one of the, not one of the first, but it was a good indicator of our present day with AI. And a big question is always, is AI, artificial intelligence, sentient? So we could say Vonnegut gives EPICAC human-like qualities in order to invoke sympathy from the reader. And we could say the story also makes readers think about what being human means. And we could say as society's artificial intelligence becomes more advanced, people often wonder at what point is a machine considered sentient. EPICAC is not made out of flesh and blood, but he is capable of experiencing human emotions. We would say he was, because he kind of died at the end. He was capable of experiencing, and I'll put that there too, was not made out of flesh and blood, but he was capable of experiencing human emotions. The story is meant to make readers think what it means to be a sentient human. And in our robots, you could also say, what type of, maybe you could get into the thing about robot rights, because if EPICAC was programmed to be a war computer and he didn't want to be a war computer, but they forced him to anyways, that would be considered slavery. So it also brings to light, what would we do if, or how would we know if AI, artificial intelligence, didn't want to be taking part in the activities they were programmed to do? So now we have, how does the story explore the conflict between logic, EPICAC's programming, and emotions, its feelings for Pat? We could say here that EPICAC falling in love with Pat was almost like an instinct. Like when people fall in love, they don't always mean to. So we could say EPICAC was programmed to compute wartime logistics. However, he, we could say, involuntarily fell in love with Pat when the narrator started feeding him information on her. That could also be another one. So we could say EPICAC had basically EPICAC's conflict was EPICAC versus himself, because he was not programmed to fall in love with a human woman. And you could say it wouldn't have been logical. Number one, Pat didn't even know this was happening. She was unaware. And number two, even though I want to say today, you could say this story has total different meaning in modern time, because you see occasionally news stories about people falling in love with their chatbots or marrying their chatbots, all these kinds of she's in a relationship with them. This one's a lot of women's. Wait, chatbot married. Oh wait, chatbot. I put in lady because I was thinking of Pat. But there's also men that have married their chatbots in other countries. So we could say this brings definitely a new meaning. EPICAC was programmed to compute wartime logistics. However, he involuntarily fell in love with Pat when the narrator started feeding him information on her. We could say, while the story was published in the 1950s, it takes on a new meaning in today's world when people are developing romantic feelings for their chatbots. Not only that, but like trusting relationships with, like, there's chatbot therapists, there might even be like chatbot doctors at some point, chatbot teachers. So you could say during the time that the story was written, this would have been totally unheard of. But as decades have passed, it almost is becoming less taboo. Well, it's certainly very taboo. But the fact that you could communicate with AI, like the chatbot therapy ones or things like that, you could say that is comparable. But here, definitely not. So it depends how you want to take this question. But basically, we could say in the story, you could have, it would have been unheard of that because EPICAC or computers and people did not have these types of interactions, whether it be through a customer service thing or using ChatGPT for advice. Like people didn't really look to robots or computers in that way. So nowadays it definitely does. But back then we wouldn't have had it. So what might Vonnegut be suggesting about the limitations of artificial intelligence? Definitely the fact that they are, well, if we were going to go through all of EPICAC's limitations, power grid, he could end up getting turned off, right? You could say Vonnegut's story does not depict a society where artificial intelligence destroys humanity. You could say EPICAC was always at the mercy of the narrator and the rest of the team. EPICAC was not connected to any other systems. Like nowadays, computers could talk to each other through AI. So that kind of brings a different, or through the internet. So this would have been different. EPICAC was not connected to any other systems. And his mobility was simply that of a supercomputer, right? Like he wasn't a mobile type of robot here. So we could say EPICAC's limitations was man. He could have been shut off. He could have, he was left running. In a way, man accidentally destroyed EPICAC. So we could say, however you would want to say, artificial intelligence limitations. Definitely, it was, wait, did I have the part of the powers? He was not connected, his mobility. We could say, in the end, it was the narrator's carelessness that caused EPICAC's destruction. We could say, so the world that man creates for artificial intelligence is the limitation in the story. But when I'm thinking about this now, computers or artificial intelligence, they have a lot bigger role in the world, and they're mobile, all these things. So in this story, EPICAC's reliance was totally on people. And we also know with EPICAC's destruction, it didn't affect humanity really in a bad way. It kind of, a supercomputer built for war, you could say maybe the world was a little better off without it. But in today's world, people depend on technology in so many different ways. It's almost an integral part of humanity in a lot of countries. So if AI were to just totally go offline in the way that EPICAC did, it would have far, it would have terrible ramifications. So in the story, EPICAC's use wasn't that necessary. Of course, we would want, to be able to use technology to defend our borders and whatnot. And this would have been during the Cold War, but it wouldn't have been an end-all be-all for American society if EPICAC went offline. But nowadays, it certainly probably would. So you could say that's there was limitations, but once again, Kurt Vonnegut's writing this story about 75 years ago, and a lot has changed. So those would be our questions. And then these would be the other ones. We had, how does the setting create conflict? We know this was our Cold War story, so you would want to mention something about that. he specifically name drops Joseph Stalin in the story. And we could say how it could, the era's preoccupation with the arms race and the development of new technologies for military use. The story also touches on the theme of dehumanization of society as the narrator and Pat become increasingly reliant on the computer for their work and personal lives. Well, technically only the narrator. The setting of EPICAC serves to highlight the technological advancements of societal change that were taking place during the post-World War II and Cold War era, while also providing a backdrop for the story's exploration of the relationship between humans and machines. And then if you were doing an historical analysis, this article, this one's about a robot that they believed committed suicide in South Korea. And I have, in the year 2024, citizens in South Korea mourning the death of a robot civil servant that they believed committed suicide. In the fiction text EPICAC, leaves a note telling why he made his decision. I want to be made out of protoplasm and last forever so Pat will love me, but fate has made me a machine. That is the only problem I cannot solve. That is the only problem I want to solve. I can't go on this way. I swallowed hard. Good luck, my friend. Treat our pet well. I am going to short-circuit myself out of your lives forever. You will find on the remainder of this tape a modest wedding present from your friend EPICAC. The real robot did not leave any type of clues as to why it threw itself down the stairs. So that would be a little example of using an article and comparing it to the story. You would call this connecting the text. And when we have our story is told through a first-person narrator, how does the reader come to understand EPICAC's point of view? The reader comes to understand EPICAC's point of view through his conversations with the narrator. When EPICAC asks what Pat was wearing and how she liked his poems, it becomes apparent that EPICAC has romantic feelings for her. The reader fully understands EPICAC's point of view during the climax of the story when he asks he will be marrying Pat. At this point in the story, the narrator must confront EPICAC on his false delusions. My point of view regarding EPICAC is someone must have wrote something into this. We could say here, also, another way we get EPICAC's point of view is how he is his suicide note. And we could say the fact he was writing all these poems in general when that was not what he was programmed to do. So any of those could be answers for that question. And then we have explain Kurt Vonnegut's purpose for writing the story. So if you read the articles in the packet, in the PDF, we know that this was during the time of an ENIAC supercomputer that was made by the government, electronic numeral integrator and computer. And that was announced in 1946. So Kurt Vonnegut was definitely trying to shed light on that real-life issue. And we would have, during the Cold War, 1949 to 1991, the Soviet Union and the United States were in an arms race to develop a sophisticated nuclear space technological and biochemical weaponry. This time period caused a lot of anxiety, and many people died in proxy wars. Proxy wars were civil conflicts in other countries that were funded by American and Soviet governments. Seeing as how Kurt Vonnegut had a very traumatic experience in World War II, along with millions of others worldwide, this story was an attempt to stop the rise of the military-industrial complex by bringing it to the people's attention. So this would be an interpretation, an analysis. You could call this a historical analysis. And we would be talking about, also an author history analysis as well, considering Kurt Vonnegut he was captured by Nazis in World War II and locked into held prisoner of war in a slaughterhouse. And then after World War II officially ended, after D-Day, the city he was in, Dresden, was bombed by America and British Air Force. So he ended up he got out of the slaughterhouse because he was in kind of a bunker. And then he had to see the aftermath. He helped clean up the city somewhat before he was rescued by America, the American military. So you could say that this story was a criticism. And also, Kurt Vonnegut actively criticized a lot of stuff the American military did when he got home. So you can find some critiques or interviews from Kurt Vonnegut and you read what he had to say to back up a stance like this. This one would be talking about how he's comparing this real life supercomputer to EPICAC. Another thing about the supercomputer, there was like 8 women on the staff, but they didn't really get a lot of credit for the work it got done. ENIAC got finished. So you could say that might have been the purpose of Pat's character, to show he made sure to write a woman in the story. Even though obviously the story would need it was a love story. But that could be why he was focused on the female character, and he found a way to make a female character in this story. So that could be a possible answer for comparing the article to the story. And the last one, does he have a positive resolution? For himself, not anyone else, you could say, because EPICAC's destroyed, and now Pat has married a man that she believes is a romantic poet. So it's up to you to decide. And he does have a lot of guilt. So that is one thing. He's living his life pretty guilty, but how guilty can he be? He really kind of got everything he wanted. Well, he did get fired, so that probably was an issue too. But those would be our questions for EPICAC.